Good afternoon and welcome to the most recent iteration of the Center for Security Policy's popular webinar series, this one entitled Beyond Iron Dome, a discussion of Israel's offensive military capabilities in the context of a nuclear Iran. I'm Victoria Coates, standing in today for our president, Fred Fleitz, who is traveling, and it is a great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests, retired Brigadier Generals Kupperwasser and Avivi from the Israeli Defense Forces for this very important discussion. I'm sure everyone woke up, as I did this morning, somewhat surprised by the news of the coup in Sudan, the collapse of this very important Abraham Accords country on the Horn of Africa, just days after the U.S. Special Representative for the Horn of Africa had visited Khartoum. And this was just the most recent in a series of extremely nasty surprises that we've endured really since August and the chaotic fall of Kabul. Last week, we had the revelation of the Chinese test of the hypersonic nuclear-capable missile, and this week we have the fall of Sudan. And all the while, our national security apparatus is consumed with issues of climate and gender and pronouns, and these are all worthy topics. However, they don't belong in the national security space because our enemies don't take them seriously, while they do take things like Chinese hypersonic nuclear-capable missiles extremely seriously. And so I think this is, as I said, an important opportunity to visit with our closest ally in the Middle East, our closest partner, because next week we could wake up and the nastygram could be a nuclear Iran. And in that case, I think Israel, which of course is in the neighborhood with the Iranian regime, will have an extremely daunting challenge at that point, and I think justifiable concerns about the role the United States might play in that case. So I thought I would start by asking both of you to say a few words of introduction, and then we have some questions for you.
Okay, so first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. I think this is a very important discussion. The Iranian issue is pressing. We feel that the clock is ticking, and probably in the next coming months or year, something will be done or must be done to prevent Iran from being nuclear. And this is an important discussion talking about that, and we're very happy to be here.
Same. I think it's a very timely discussion, as the Iranians are making progress towards having the capability to produce a nuclear weapon. And I think that we are faced with what people try to portray as two options, but we believe there are more than just two options. It's not just that we have to choose between the two problematic options of whether allowing them to rush to a bomb right now or going back to the JCPOA with all its problematic characteristics and big holes in it. And we think that we should make sure that we do not get to fork between only those two options, and we have to produce more options.
Well, and I also was remiss in not introducing the NGO that you're representing, the Israel's Defense and Security Forum, which is one of the good NGOs, since they've been rather in the news in recent days. And also wanted to mention that General Kupperwasser has served as the Director General of the Ministry of International Affairs and Strategy, and also here in Washington, D.C. as the Assistant Defense Attaché for Intelligence at the Israeli Embassy. General Avivi has served in the IDF for 3 decades, including as the head of the Auditing and Consulting Department of the Israeli Defense Establishment and the General Chief of Staff's aide-de-camp and the Deputy Division Commander on the Gaza Front, which is certainly a hot seat. I'd like to kick it over to my close colleague, Ellie Cohanim, for the first question.
Good afternoon. Before the mic is working, okay. Before we move on to questions, I also just want to share some of the work at the Center for Security Policy, because you mentioned, General, two options when it comes to Iran, and I think that at the same time that we don't want to look at Iran with only two options, we should also look at the Iranian question not as a two-option scenario. What I mean specifically by that is that this summer, Dr. Victoria Coates and I led a delegation of Iranian expatriates political opposition figures and former political prisoner to Iran. It was the first delegation to Israel since 1979, Islamic Revolution, and they wanted to go in solidarity with the people of Israel and with the state of Israel after the Gaza conflict. And so I think that it's also important for us to always delineate the difference between the Iranian regime, which from its very founding and ideology is anti-Semitic in its nature and poses a virulently anti-Semitic threat to the state of Israel, and that's what Israel is dealing with. And the Iranian people, which over and over have rejected this hateful ideology, and we've all seen videos of moments where the regime has painted the Israeli flag on the ground in Iran, and people, rather than stepping on the flag as the regime want them to do, they've jumped over the flag as a sign of their solidarity with the people of Israel. So with that, I wanted to start the framing of this conversation. Our first question to you, gentlemen, was, do you believe that Israel's defense and intelligence establishment hold the fundamental view that Israel, and only Israel, is responsible for the security of the Jewish state? Or is there a belief that Israel can ultimately rely on the U.S. for her own security? And we would love to hear both of your responses. So General Avivi, maybe you'd start with that.
So I think that there is a clear notion in Israel. I think the main lesson learned from the Holocaust is that the Jewish people overall, and certainly the state of Israel, need to be able to defend themselves by themselves. This is the essence of Zionism. This is why we came back to Israel. This is why we established again a Jewish state, to be sovereign, to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves. And we believe that the stronger we are and the more capable we are to defend ourselves by ourselves, the better are the chances to have alliances and other countries like the US wanting to partner with us and help us. When we were defenseless in the Holocaust, nobody helped us, not even the US. Ships were sent back to Europe, and people who tried to escape from Europe, Jews who tried to escape to the States, were sent back and were killed. So this is a very important issue to understand. You are respected in this world if you are strong. You will have peace, you will have prosperity if you are strong. And the Jewish people and the state of Israel need to be very strong and self-capable to defend themselves by themselves.
So if I understand correctly, you think the answer is yes, the security military establishment. Would you agree with that?
I agree with the principle, of course. We have to be able to protect ourselves by ourselves and defend against any kind of threat that may arise. At the same time, it's something that cannot be materialized the way we want it to, because we are only 9.5 million people living in Israel, and we are facing such immense threats from all over the area around us, that to think that we can really do all of that without some help from our friends, is a little bit too optimistic. And that's why we need the support, and we have a strategic alliance with the United States, and we are building new alliances with other peoples and other states in the region. That's the Abrahamic Accords on the one hand. We have today a special relations with Greece and Cyprus. We are improving our relations with other countries that have the same worldview like ours. Many people in the West, by the way, are also operating under the assumption that the security of Israel is actually the security of the West. And that's why they are committed to Israel's security, and we are welcoming, of course, anybody who wants to help. It's more than even that. You know, in the past, I remember the days when there was this understanding that we, because of our size, we have to be able to take care of the immediate threats, those that emanate from the countries near to us, Syria, Egypt, when it was still, we didn't have peace with Egypt at the time, and maybe with the second tier countries like Iraq. It was a big question whether Iraq should be handled by Israel or no. And when the Iraqis were building a nuclear reactor and planning to have a nuclear bomb, Israel first of all came to the United States and said, "Why won't you handle that?" And this was the perception at the time. Even Begin at the time thought that the first place to go to is the United States. Today, I think we we take upon ourselves a very heavy burden because we understand we cannot rely on anybody else to do the job. And that's why we have to develop our own capability. And developing the capability to handle threats that may emanate and come from Iran is extremely costly for a small state like Israel. So we think we're very big, and we develop all kinds of capabilities that are, we carried out an operation in Entebbe, and we did all kinds of crazy stuff. But to build a robust capability to handle a country like Iran is not something that is simple, and that's why we need more cooperation with many more peoples and the countries are in the region and beyond the region, primarily the United States.
If I could just follow up on that, could you talk a little bit about what a nuclear Iran would mean to the region? You mentioned Iraq and the action against that reactor. Obviously, there's Syria as well. So those two have been prevented. What would a nuclear Iran mean to the broader Middle East?
Well, I think you have to look at it from two angles, and then go to the Israeli angle as a third angle. The two first angles is that if Iran manages to have even the capability to produce nuclear weapon, let alone produce a nuclear weapon, this will be considered as a major achievement of the radical camp in the Middle East. We are saying the same about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's peanuts. It's if the Iranians manage to have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, then it means that in spite of all the sanctions, in spite of all the pressures, in spite of all the threats, in spite of all the difficulties, they manage to get what they want and to become the hegemonic power that they want to become in the Middle East and beyond, because this is not about the Middle East. Their mission, the mission of this regime, is to spread Islam in their version all over the world. The Middle East is just the first stop on the way. And now that they managed to prove that they can do it in spite of the United States pressure, in spite of everything, this is going to be immense. Secondly, it's going to ignite it is already igniting, but it's going to ignite even much more, much bigger arms race in the Middle East. And everybody would like to have and what is the United States going to say to Saudi Arabia or to Algeria or to anybody else who wants to have a nuclear weapon? You can't have it, but the Iranians can. So everybody's going to have a nuclear weapon, and it's going to be a crazy Middle East that we're going to face. And thirdly, from the Israeli point of view, it's extremely dangerous, because these people don't hide their intention to wipe us off the map of the world. So we can't afford a situation where the Iranians have the capability to produce nuclear weapons. Of course, we can't afford the situation where the Iranians actually have nuclear weapons, but in order to prevent that from happening, we have to make sure that they don't have the capability to produce nuclear weapons.
General Avivi, did you?
So I will just add that if, God forbid, they have nuclear weapons, the regime will feel secure. They will feel that they cannot be attacked anymore, just as we see in North Korea. I mean, this failed country, but with a nuclear weapon, is able to threat the US, is able to be bold. They will feel the same. And they will spread terror all over the Middle East, much more than they are doing at the moment. So they're determined to procure nuclear weapons. They believe that this is the key for their ability not only to be a strong power in the world, but to keep the regime in place for generations to come. And this is why they must be stopped. I mean, of course, they also pose an existential threat to Israel, because they are radical, and it seems like they are willing to use these weapons, whether directly or whether through a terror organization. So the issue of proliferation, it's a big issue. Talking about where all these weapons are going to go, all this know-how. It won't stay only on the government's level. It might also be found afterwards in Hezbollah or other places.
So on that note, we actually just saw media reports that Israel has just appropriated $1.5 billion to develop offensive capabilities against Iran. The question that we had for you, generals, is that too little, too late? And General Avivi, maybe you could start.
Yeah, so in my last position in the IDF and the Ministry of Defense, I oversaw the preparations. Some of the things I did is overseeing the preparations of the IDF for such a scenario. And I can say that this is not new. We have been training and preparing and developing technologies and know-how for this moment many years. The capability to conduct a military operation against Iran has many aspects, such as the relevant intelligence, the relevant capabilities, talking about the Air Force. And it's not something you can do in a year or a year and a half. And it's not one budget. It's a long-term process. And Israel is getting better and better and ready as time goes by. So it comes as no surprise that now even they are investing further in order to accelerate this process. And we'll see what happens, if it will be needed or not. Time will tell.
I will add to that the reason we have to add all the time more and more funding for our preparations to face the Iranian threat is that while we are building the capabilities to deal with it, the Iranians are also building their capabilities, and so you cannot look at the confrontation with Iran as a one-event situation. It's not that you go, you strike, you go back and go to sleep. This is going to look like a very intensive confrontation, and the capabilities of the Iranians are growing all the time. Now the new toy that they have developed is the UAVs, the loitering UAVs and the other stuff like cruise missiles and this kind of stuff that were not present when we started planning for this eventuality. So we have to invest money in foiling their attempts on these arenas as well, and it costs a lot of money. And that's why we have to add all the time more and more investments in building our capabilities. We've been building them for a long time. The decision about the F-35 came a long time ago, like 10 years ago, so even more. So it's a long process of building the capabilities that all the time both sides are preparing for this doomsday. And we have to be at least one step ahead of our enemy, if not 2 or 3, to make sure that we are going to have the upper hand if this happened. And by the way, as long as the Iranians believe that we are going to have the upper hand, this is the most important deterrence for them not to try and break out for the weapon. So it's very important for the United States, if they don't want to see an escalation in the Middle East, to make sure that Israel is considered by the Iranians as having a clear advantage over Iran if something happens, because this is the main deterrence from allowing the Iranians moving forward. If it was not there, the Iranians would have moved already.
How challenging do you think it is going to be for the United States to establish that deterrence after Afghanistan?
More challenging than before. Let's put it this way. It's maybe even much more challenging, because much of the situation is based on perceptions. It's not only just judging the capabilities of each side. And the reason it is based on perceptions because the capabilities without the readiness to use the capabilities is not enough. You have to show that you are ready to use your capabilities. And the lesson learned, the radical Muslims, the radical Islamists in the Middle East have long said that the West is extremely weak, is not ready to pay the price that goes with ongoing struggle for its values, if it has any values, because they don't believe that the West has any values that are worth dying for. And if this is the case, then you can move forward and challenge it. And Afghanistan, for the radical Islamists, is a proof that they were right. The West, and especially America, are not willing to pay the price that goes along with fighting for your values. And this is the most important thing. If the enemy, how come, many people ask, how come the Taliban with a much smaller army managed to so easily win the war against the government forces in Afghanistan? It's not that the government forces were less well equipped. It's the spirit. And if the West doesn't have the spirit that is necessary in order to fight, then our time has come. That's what radicals would argue. And I think that once this is the perception, the challenge for the United States is much bigger to prove that no, we just made a calculation that it's not worthwhile to invest here, but we are ready to fight there. It's not self-evident that this is the case. You have to prove that this is the case. Now, when you look at the way the Americans are handling the negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue, you don't get the feeling that this is the case, that they are ready to, even on the if you look at the phrasing, in the past, even the Obama administration used to use the term, all options are on the table. Mm-hmm. You don't hear it from the Biden administration. We shall be ready to explore other options if this option doesn't work. But it doesn't yet, we're not saying that they're already on the table. It's, this entire vocabulary is not very convincing in the eyes of the Iranians. I think the language of the Israelis is much more convincing, much more
deterring.
Deterring, yes.
Well, I mean, and that brings me to the question of where Israel stands on these issues today, because, with the recent visit of Israel's prime minister to the United States, there is a sense that the new Israeli coalition is reluctant to create daylight between the U.S. government and Israel along the lines of the daylight that we did see between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration. So the question here is Israel willing to take military and defense actions that it would deem necessary to do so if it would create not only daylight between Israel and the U.S., but actual conflict with the Biden administration?
I think that there is still an understanding in the Israeli government that if it's needed, we are willing to take military action against Iran, even at the price that the U.S. administration won't be happy about that. So this is why they're investing money. This is why preparations are done. But the government also is saying we want to talk with the administration about that, but we want to keep good relationships, and we don't want to create pressure, and we don't want to go to Congress and talk directly to the Congress and not with the administration. So they're trying to show, I would say mainly for the inner politics and so on, that they are dealing with the administration in a different way than Netanyahu. But at the end of the day, the notion is the same notion. Israel needs to be ready to act by itself. And there is still a window of opportunity to change things. Talking about, what we talked about before, I see Iran as an opportunity for the Biden administration to build deterrence again. And without needing to spend 20 years on the ground in a place like Afghanistan, because at the end of the day, dealing with Iranians' nuclear program is a major airstrike. That's what it is. And it's something that is classic for US capabilities. It doesn't mean afterwards that you need to invest troops on the ground. So this needs to be looked as an opportunity to build deterrence, and the US needs desperately this deterrence in the Middle East, because there is no vacuum. If the US withdraws from the Middle East, it's Russia, China, Turkey, other powers will go in and control this area, and then to change it back and try to change the policies will be very difficult.
So General Avivi, just so our audience really understood that, you're saying that the U.S. could reclaim its deterrence in the Middle East simply through an airstrike against nuclear facilities in Iran, and that is something that the U.S. Army excels at doing.
I think they are prepared to do it, they know how to do it, and that would be the best option. It's a much better option than Israel doing it by itself. The Iran nuclear program is not an Israeli problem. It's a global problem that needs to be addressed by a global force.
Along those lines, obviously, the security partnership between Israel and the United States has enjoyed robust bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, which is where the money comes from. So understanding that the current Israeli administration does not want to be seen to go around the U.S. administration to go directly to Congress, but if the Congress were to take it upon itself to act to support Israel's security, the title of our discussion is Beyond Iron Dome. Obviously, the missile defense systems are enormously important. It saved thousands of lives. David Sling is my personal favorite, but they're all good. But they are, inherently defensive, and then you're sitting there waiting. If you put all your eggs in that basket, you're sitting there waiting for the Iranians to attack. Is there anything you would recommend Congress look at to bolster other capabilities, even while being very mindful of the missile defense needs?
Well, there are all kinds of capabilities. I'm not sure that we want to go into the details of that, but much have been said about the mother of all bombs being lent to Israel and with the capability to use it. It's one possibility, but don't underestimate the David Sling and the Iron Dome and the Arrow and all of these defensive systems that are very important in the context of the follow-up of any military activity in Iran, be it American or be it Israeli, by the way. We shall probably are going to be a target for the Iranians even if the Americans do something. So it's, we have to take this into account. So it's extremely important here. Look, our goal, I think, is not necessarily to hit Iran militarily. If we end up with then the need to do that either by Israel or the United States is a failure of deterrence. We need to first and foremost build on deterrence, and the Americans are playing in this field. This presentation of the last GBU 72 was a step in trying to send a message to the Iranians. Listen, we haven't given up on the idea of bunker busting. Okay, that's an important message. I think there are better ways to deliver the message. One of the ways would be by giving some new capabilities to Israel. That would be a very clear message to the Iranians, not necessarily by encouraging Israel to do something, but by telling the Iranians, listen, we give Israel a longer leash. We want Israel to be able to do things without asking us, if necessary. Of course, if necessary. And the Israeli government has made it clear that it's going to discuss the necessity of anything with the Americans. It doesn't mean necessarily, and that was not said by the Israelis, that we are going to take the American advice on that. We're not going to surprise, but this doesn't mean that we give up our freedom of decision. We shall eventually do what is necessary for the security of the state of Israel. That's what we're going to do, with or without an American support. And we would much prefer American support, of course. We even much prefer American decision to lead the effort, as General Avivi said. If the Americans are going to say, no, we are leading, which they didn't do neither in Iraq nor in Syria. Although they were given the opportunity in both cases to do that, they chose not to do that. It was very important that Israel had the capability to do it by itself. Here too, it would be much preferable if the Americans would say, listen, leave it to us. Definitely the Americans are more capable than Israel in this respect, as General Avivi said, and this is the case. We're talking about two different situations. But even if the Americans do not take it fully upon themselves, and I hear all kinds of pundits in Washington saying, okay, we are not going to do it anyhow, so let's help Israel be more capable. Okay, as a second best, this is another reasonable way of action.
So we spoke earlier also about not only the United States' role, but the regional states. I believe that the Middle East, North Africa has fundamentally changed following the Abraham Accords. And just last month, thanks to the work of people like Victoria Coates under the Trump administration, we heard announcement of Israeli integration into Centcom. Do you think that that the regional partners the regional states can partner with Israel now to create some sort of a security architecture against Iran? And is there something new that didn't exist, let's say, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago?
First of all, the decision to integrate Israel in Centcom was a very, very good decision. Because at the end of the day, Centcom is in charge of the Middle East and Iran. So now there is a capability to look in a whole way, looking at the Arab states and Israel and in our mutual interest in coping with the Iranian threat. So obviously the coordination, the triangular coordination, the US, Israel, and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and so on, will improve, and it is improving. I think the relations with the Gulf states are deepening. For us, strategically, this is a big deal because it enables us to get closer to Iran. Iran is trying to do this to us. They are surrounding us in Lebanon. They are trying to get to our border in Syria. They are weaponizing Hamas. And we are doing the same. We have strong relations with Azerbaijan. We have got good relations with the Gulf states, and this enables us to get closer to Iran and more effective in the way we can operate. So I think this coordination, the more the Iranians pose a threat, the bigger the coordination will be between us and the Arab states, Sunni Arab states.
I can add to that. I think from the point of view of the moderate Arab states, frustrated with the American withdrawal from the Middle East, frustrated with the attitude so far taken by the Biden administration and the Iran deal. They have basically three options. And by the way, they are moving, they are not exclusively, mutually exclusive. They can move on the three options simultaneously, and this is what they do. One option is to ease the tensions with Iran. When the US is not around, they are very fearful, and they would try to improve relations with Iran. We saw the Saudi Arabia testing the waters in this respect, and many others. All of a sudden, they start speaking with Iran, even though Iran is now under a more radical president. They still go and speak with Iran now. The second option is to improve relations with Israel. Israel is there, is reliable. It's not going to change its attitude. It doesn't matter who is the prime minister. Its attitude on this issue is clear. It's always going to be supporting the moderates in the Middle East, be it in Egypt, be it in Jordan, be it in the Gulf states, wherever. So let's check what we can do with Israel in order to get stronger. This flight today from Saudi Arabia to Israel is another sign that this is while they speak with the Iranians, they send a plane to Israel. Okay, so they choose both at the same time. And the third option is to get better militarily equipped to defend yourself by yourself. And if you can use the Israeli ties in order to get better equipped, it's a good idea. So this is what the UAE has done with the F-35 deal, and I guess Saudi Arabia is doing the same, trying to get weapons from wherever they can. If it be it from, they just had a Greek battery of anti-air capabilities, the Patriots in Saudi Arabia. So you can get it from Greece, you can get it from whoever is ready to help. Especially as they feel that the Americans are are not necessarily their wisdom, not as they were before, let's put it this way. They are, but less than they were before. So this is another effort that we shall see happening, and all these things are going to happen simultaneously. We, in Israel, I think also the Americans should support the moderate states. Human rights are extremely important. We can demand from them to have a better record on human rights. And it's a problematic situation. But they know better their ground. And they understand their challenges differently than we do. And we have to be attentive to their explanation of what they're facing. And look, there's this feeling that the threat of extreme radical Islam has disappeared. It has not. It is still there, very much so.
On the contrary, it's growing.
You can
Afghanistan.
say, to some extent it's growing. It's people can also point at the fact that, okay, there's no caliphate in Iran and Iraq, in Iraq and Syria as there used to be. But definitely one thing, in the hearts of many radical Muslims, the idea is still alive. And and they understand it. They need to fight against it. So we have to bear that in mind when we criticize their record on human rights. And I'm not saying that they have a good record, they don't. But we have to take this into account and make sure that we support their survival. For them, it's a matter of survival. And we have to be there and to help them. And Israel is clear on that. Not everybody is as clear as Israel on this matter.
If I could go back to a point you made earlier, which I don't think is particularly well understood, which is the difference between Iran having the capability to develop a nuclear weapon versus the regime actually possessing the weapon. I thought we had a real moment of clarity in 2018 when Israel exposed the Iranian nuclear archive. The argument behind the JCPOA was that they had never intended to get a weapon. That was their claim, that they had no military dimension to their nuclear program. That was a lie. They very much were pursuing the capability. The only thing they hadn't done was go to actually possessing it. So could you talk a little bit about how Israel views the difference between capability versus possession?
Well, I think that what we have agreed upon for a long time is that if the Iranians manage to have enough fissile material to produce a nuclear device, this would mean that Iran has the capability to produce a nuclear weapon. That was agreed upon between Israel and the United States and the rest of the P5+1 as the measurement to know when is Iran able to produce nuclear weapons. And that's why the entire idea of the JCPOA was to keep Iran 1 year away from having the capability to produce the sufficient quantity of fissile material for producing a nuclear device. That was the logic behind it. And the reason for that is that once you have it, the weaponization of this amount of fissile material is something that can be done in a hidden place, and you never know how long it's going to take. The JCPOA was also based on the idea that you cannot enter it before you realize where the Iranians stand on weaponization. And we had to work out the potential military dimensions of the Iranian nuclear project before we entered the JCPOA. And Yukiya Amano at the time, the Secretary General of the General Director actually of the IAEA, was ready to sign a letter that said, okay, you can enter the agreement. We are not going to make more progress on the potential military dimensions. But here came the 2018 archive and clarified that what we thought we knew about the potential military dimensions of the Iranian project was far away from the truth. The truth was that they were making a lot of progress that we were not aware of. And even today, there are still 4 sites in Iran that was not at all declared by the Iranians, in which some nuclear activity was carried out, some nuclear material was found, And we don't know anything about it because the Iranians do not cooperate with the IAEA about it. And nevertheless, nobody even goes to the Security Council to say, hey, these guys have just breached the NPT, not the JCPOA. They breached the NPT. And it's not a good enough reason to go to the Security Council. It's ridiculous. And because we have all these information gaps, because the JCPOA has no capacity to the IAEA to inspect what's going on with the Iranian experts on nuclear matters, those who know what to do with the fissile material. There is no ability to know what have they been up to in the last few years. We are very concerned with the situation when the Iranians get to the point where they have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, and that's what we have to prevent. The Americans are saying, most of the time, definitely when we are not in the room, are saying, let's prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. I just, recently I had, I think it was Rob Malley, who said that we have to get prepared to a situation where the Iranians are going to be almost capable to produce nuclear weapons. This is a situation Israel doesn't want to get prepared prepared to living with. That's a very dangerous situation. You don't know. Nobody knows. I heard some people in Israel saying, yeah, even if it happens, if they get there, they'll still need something like 2 years before they have the weapon. I don't think they really know. I don't think anybody knows where exactly the Iranians stand. That's why there's a big difference between Israel and the United States in defining the need, the purpose of this entire effort. We say we should prevent Iran from having the capability to produce nuclear weapons because we don't know what's going to happen once they have it. And we are sure that if they have the capability to turn it into a nuclear weapon, they will. And the United States says, let's make sure that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. But the way to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons is to prevent it from having the capability to produce nuclear weapons. And that's something that has to be clear, that the United States should join us in saying Iran should not have the capability to produce nuclear weapons. That's cream matter. This was as I said, this was the logic. We managed to make this the logic of the JCPOA. Keep it 1 year away from having this capability. But the price the Americans were ready to pay for getting this from the Iranians was that they promised them to have the capability to produce a big arsenal of nuclear weapons without any threshold that stands between them and having this capability in 10 to 15 years. That was the very heavy price that we were very much against. We said it's not only important not to let them have the capability to produce nuclear weapons now. The important thing is to keep them away from having this capability for a very long time, hopefully forever. But definitely for a very long time, not only for 15 years, it's nothing. This is the core of the disagreements between us and the Americans for a long time on this matter.
I think that the gap in this sense is the gap that has to do with the understanding what is this regime all about. We understand that this regime is a radical regime that wants to be a world power and implement Sharia all over the world. And we understand that they are determined to have nuclear weapons. This is the biggest strategic plan they have. They are determined to do so. So the moment they will have the capability, they will do it. And we saw again and again in Libya and then in North Korea that intelligence don't always know what's going on. I mean, Libya procured nuclear weapons, nobody knew about it, even Israel didn't know about it. North Korea, the US was surprised, although they monitored it for a long time and had talks and so on. So we need to take in account that once they will have the capability, they will build nuclear weapons. And so the only thing we can really deal with is preventing them from having this capability and not deal with their decision when to do it. We cannot control what they decide.
Let's face it, the Western intelligence was lucky to know on time, but was far away from knowing in advance the details of the Iranian nuclear program. We knew knew parts of what was in the archives, but not far from all. We didn't know about a lot of sites beyond those 4 sites that I mentioned before. We didn't know about a lot of facilities inside Parchin that were exposed only thanks to the archive. We knew much less than we should have known. We knew about Fordow, the big issue, the Fordow underground, deep underground facility. We learned about it very late, very late. Fortunately, before it was operational, but very late. If you just build on intelligence, it's not enough. And I'm saying it as a person coming from the intelligence, but I'm humble enough to understand the limits of my profession.
So if I may, and then we have to take Q&A from audience. So I think just to bring us back to the theme of this conversation, with everything that you both just said, do you think that Israel's current government has the political will and the appetite, if necessary, to move from a defensive military posture to an offensive posture? And does Israel fight to win? You know, I think this is a new question for Western militaries. Does Israel fight for victory? Does Israel fight to win?
Well, I think that first of all, if there will be a need to have a military operation in Iran, we might see a change in the government. We might see a situation where you need a united government. I can hardly see this government going to such a big scale operation, which is not only about attacking Iran. This will mean also a war probably with Hezbollah and maybe also Islamic Jihad and Hamas. This will be a regional war. You don't go to a regional war with a government like that. I mean, the government will have to change, and you'll have probably the opposition joining the government. And once they do, probably some parties, mainly the Arab parties, will leave the government, and we'll see a change. But if I had to guess what is going on in Bennett's head, he wants to prove to his voters that he is still right-wing, that he is still determined, that he always talked about the need for victory and so on. And this is why I wanted to be also a defense minister. So definitely if there is something he would like to leave as something meaningful he did, that would be probably taking care of this threat.
I think, first of all, Israel is not trigger happy. So we're not looking for confrontation. If we can get what we want through diplomatic ways, through deterrence, through anything else, but we should definitely prefer it. But if the need arises and there's no other option, then I think even this government, they probably need the unity government to feel more secure, but it's not necessary, because definitely the opposition, is the kind of opposition we have today, is not going to stand against it. So it's, if they reach the decision that they need to operate, I think they can take the decision. Much will depend on the way they appreciate the results and the way they appreciate the capabilities and so on. So these are things that, of course, cannot be shared. But I'm sure that they understand that they cannot afford seeing Iran getting closer to the capability to produce nuclear weapons. I sincerely hope that this is not going to be only an Israeli decision. I think, as General Avivi said, the problem is Israel is having an Iranian problem, but this is not Israel's problem. It's a much bigger problem, and everybody has to be on that together.
Well, we have a few minutes to take some questions. I know we have our first question from Senior Fellow Carolyn Glick in Jerusalem.
That's right. Given where Iran's program now stands, has the time come to say that U.S.-led efforts to prevent Iran from going nuclear have failed?
I don't think we can say that it already has failed. I think there is still a window of opportunity if we'll see more willingness for deterrence, for a strong position against Iran, I think the US can still change the course of the talks, put a smoking gun on the table and say that they're ready to use it, strengthen the sanctions and demand a new agreement. I feel that there is a realization that the Iranians are playing with them. They're not having serious talks, they're just stalling and moving forward with the plan. So the big question is, when and if they're going to realize what the Iranians are doing, and that the fact that you cannot appease the Iranians, you need to be strong. And I agree with General Kupperwasser that before you go to a military operation, there are several steps before. There can be a new agreement, there can be harsher sanctions, and a threat on the regime before we have a military operation. But I don't think it's over. I think there is still a chance that we might see something different from the administration.
You want to add anything?
I think that what we have to understand is that what the Iranians fear is that we shall, the question will move from confrontation with the capability to turn into a low-intensity conflict into a confrontation that can turn into high-intensity conflict. And as long as they have some kind of fear like that, they may not move up to the point where there is a chance that the other side will think that there is no return. That's beyond the point of no return. And so that's the way the Iranians play right now, and this gives place for what General Avivi said. But life is full of mistakes. And even the Iranians, divine as they are, the leadership is bound to make mistakes. And they may think that the weakness that is seen on behalf of the Americans can be translated into moving even farther. That is something that we should be very careful to make sure it doesn't happen. We are not far away from there. There's still room, but not a lot of room. Because look, the Iranians are crossing every day another hurdle that makes the coming back to the JCPOA ridiculous. They already produce 60% enriched uranium. They already produce uranium metal. They already master IR24, IR4, IR6, IR9 centrifuges. These are things that were supposed to happen in several years from now. It's already done. What is the point in coming back to the JCPOA? The situation is changing continuously, and it's something that the Iranians may think that the other side doesn't understand, but it does. I mean, even Secretary Blinken said that we are getting to the point where closer and closer to the point where there's no point in coming back to the JCPOA. There's only a limited room to maneuver between where we are and reaching a situation where we can say that the policy of the United States failed in preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Now, I want to add one thing. It's still better to handle Iran trying to have the capability to produce one nuclear device than facing Iran that can have a big arsenal of nuclear weapons. Still, the current situation with all its risks, it's better than coming back to the JCPOA. That is extremely important to remember.
A question from Shoshana Bryan of the Jewish Policy Center. Iran controls 4 countries in the region: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. Jordan is teetering, and Saudi Arabia is wondering. For Israel, when is it time to eliminate the Iranian regime, not because of its nuclear weapons, but its on-the-ground destruction? Doesn't it have to happen before Iran has nukes?
Great question.
Well, we would like to see a different regime in Iran. We have nothing against it's not that we have nothing against the Iranian people. We have a lot in favor of the Iranian people. We want to be friends of the Iranian people. We are working at that all the time. But the fact is that there is no international coalition that is ready to face Iran on that matter. When you see Joseph Borrell, representative, go to participate in the inauguration of Ibrahim Raisi, you understand that they don't care, that they don't give a damn about the fate of the Iranian people. And when you hear the international community saying, let's focus on the Iran nuclear issue and put aside all other issues, including the missiles, not only the human rights in Iran, but let's put aside the missiles. It seems that nobody really cares about human rights in Iran. They execute people. They execute people that just for saying something critical of the regime. And nobody does anything. Nadim Afkari was executed, and nobody said anything. Can Israel just alone make the regime in Iran change? No. The only thing we can do is pray together with the rest of the Iranians that they will have a better future. And yes, if the regime changes, I'm sure that the nuclear issue will be solved by itself. In a much better way than the other options. It's one of the options that, when I said before that there are not only two options, that's another option. Do something about this regime. This is a radical missionary regime, and replace it with reasonable regime that cares about the well-being of its people. Look, the Iranian regime took its people to a terrible situation just because its commitment to have nuclear weapons. I mean, if it was not for their commitment to nuclear weapons, there were not sanctions, there were no steps taken against their people. Just because they insist on having nuclear weapons, they take the entire population of Iran into this terrible situation that they have to suffer. This is ridiculous. And it's so painful to see that the Iranian people doesn't have the capability to change this situation, because the regime doesn't have any second thought about killing its own people.
I will try to address the question, but in a different way. Israel doesn't think that we can bring down the regime, okay? But we have another big dilemma. The dilemma is, do you deal with the proxies before you deal with Iran? And we had an interesting discussion, for example, about Gaza. The question, Gaza is attacking us constantly, why aren't we conquering and destroying Hamas? We can do that. So one of the reasons is not put the army now in Gaza because we need to prepare for Iran. So one of the questions is, what comes first? Do we deal with the proxies and then be ready to deal with Iran, or we hold for the moment and prepare for Iran? This is the dilemma, and it's every day. And each operation we have in Gaza or deterioration on the northern border, this question rises. And it seems at the moment that in the last decade, the idea was, let's prepare first of all for dealing with the Iranian nuclear program and not sending the army now for a long operation in Lebanon or in Gaza.
Oh, with that, we'll have to throw back to Victoria. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Adam, and for everybody who attended today, and especially to our distinguished guests, General Kupperwasser and General Avivi. Very much enjoyed this sobering discussion, but a very important one to have, I think, at this moment. And as I said, thanks to everyone who attended. I believe our next webinar is coming up on November 5th, or November 3rd, which will be on the structure of the JCPOA, on the Iranian deal. So I think it will dovetail nicely with this discussion. And so please consult the center's website, and thank you for your support.